looks very, it's a very affectionate portrait, and that's because it was done by his cousin.
Oops. Sorry, I've just unmuted you by accident. I've just muted you by accident. Could you unmute yourself, David? Sorry.
Okay, yeah. I like this portrait of Maxwell because it was done by his cousin Jemima, and it has the look of an artist who had affection for the man. And so I like to choose this one. And I have just managed to lose my own my own screen on this. Apologies. Sorry, I just go back to that. Sorry, I've got the. Do you know how to get out of this? I've got the. I'm looking at the people rather than my own presentation at the moment.
Okay.
Let me just go down. Oh, right, I'm back. I'm back. Right. All right. All right. So my plan, such as I have it, is to follow the timeline through Maxwell's life, looking at the people and the places involved in it, and along the way talk about his science. And the crowning glory of his work is what is known as Maxwell's equations. But he did very significant science on lots of different topics, including color, thermodynamics, control theory. And my overall aim is to convert you to be disciples of Maxwell, to spread the word of somebody who I think is really rather under-recognized and underappreciated, and it's our job as a foundation to try and correct that, but we would like as many people out there contributing to that aim. So we better start, as John said, back in Penicuik, and actually pre-James, and see what happened. Well, Captains James Clerk and Janet Irvine had 3 children, and the inheritance chain that started was that George became the 6th Baronet of Penicuik, and John, as the second son, inherited the lands and properties down in the south of Scotland in Dumfries and Galloway, which is called Middlebie, but I'll refer to Glenlair throughout. And here's the first interesting thing, which is that when John inherited Glenlair, a legal condition was that he added Maxwell to his name. So there's certainly a throw of the dice in all these events that led to Maxwell being called Maxwell, which he is universally known as rather than Clerk, but it could as easily have been James Clerk rather than James Clerk Maxwell. And sister Isabella, she married James Wedderburn of Inveresk, and they settled in 31 Heriot Row, which is of some significance in this story. So the early years, 1831, so it was the 13th of June in 1831 when James was born at 14 India Street. So looking forward just a little bit, it will be soon 200 years since he was born. And as you look inside, we will look at the hallway here, and the foundation owns this building, and we have the ground and first floors set up as a museum with lots of poster displays and artifacts as well of James and his life. Amongst those is a rather charming sketch of James as a baby, and this is really rather, it's extremely nice. And it was done by William Dyce, and it was based on something that he had done for Midsummer Night's Dream, a drawing of Puck back in 1825. And Dice then also did this portrait of Francis's mother and James as a child. The original is in Birmingham these days. And Dice was actually related into the family as Francis's brother married William Dice's sister. And so that was possibly the connection by which these portraits were made. So James spent the first 2 years of his life in India Street, but John really enjoyed owning the country estate down at Glenlair and much preferred to be there than in Edinburgh. And so they moved back to Glenlair when James was still a 2-year-old. And he was, as you might imagine, a very inquisitive child. And the question in his mouth all the time was, what's the go of that? And he was never content with a superficial reply. He really was discriminating and always asked then the follow-up was, but what's a particular go? How does it really work? So in those early days, then James's mother was educating him, but then there was a tragedy because she died in December 1839 as a result of abdominal cancer. And tragically, again, this is almost precisely what happened to James in due course. His father employed a local tutor whose methods seemed to involve thrashing knowledge into his pupils. So it didn't really work out. And James was now a country boy with a Galwegian accent. And he also had the benefit of his father designing his clothes for him. But having spent his childhood there, he really inherited his father's love for Glenlair. But in order to advance his education, he was sent back to Edinburgh and he went to stay with his Aunt Isabella at 31 Heriot Row. And he went to Edinburgh Academy, where because he didn't sound or look the part amongst the elite lads of Edinburgh at the time, he was labelled dafty. And he also had a disadvantage of, for purely administrative reasons, being stuck in the second year when he belonged in the first. But despite that, he managed to make friends, specifically Peter Guthrie Tate, a very significant figure throughout his life, Lewis Campbell, who wrote his biography shortly after he died, and Fleming Jenkin, who became Professor of Engineering at Edinburgh. And in the family, of course, Aunt Isabella, where he stayed at Heriot Row, his cousin Jemima, who made this watercolour. You can see James, the boy of 10, arriving, and Jemima shows herself as a bonnet. She was 18, and so she did this wonderful watercolor. She became a well-known watercolorist in her own right. Her paintings were gifted to Queen Victoria's children, and there's a very plausible story that that the character of Jemima Puddleduck was named after her by Beatrix Potter, who also received some of her watercolors. And Francis's sister was Jane, living in Great Stewart Street. And so perhaps she kind of substituted as a mother figure for her sister while James was there. I'd looked at this many times and I couldn't work out what that writing was. But then I read very recently that the servant was called Horny. And so I think you can see from his hairstyle the reason for that. So that is one mystery solved. I'll just say a word about Peter Guthrie Tate. So he was from Dalkeith, a month older, and they had this friendship at school, although by chance they ended up in different years, Maxwell in the higher year, but they used to set each other all kinds of questions. And Tate himself had a brilliant career and one of these annoying people who are good at everything. So he played rugby for Scotland, as did his son, and his other son won the amateur championship in golf a couple of times. So a very significant and very able figure. While at school at Edinburgh Academy, Maxwell presented his father with a sheaf of papers that he'd done all on his own initiative on the left, and we have the original in the house courtesy of Edinburgh Academy. And he, as we probably would say, gosh, that looks good. I'll pass it on to the professor of physics at Edinburgh University, who's called James Forbes. And Forbes was impressed. He passed it on to the professor of maths, who was also impressed. And so the upshot was his work, which you can read there, Mr. Clerk Maxwell ingeniously suggests. It was presented by Forbes at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And so this was written up and became James's first scientific publication at the age of 14. And there's very few people who can say that. And perhaps this also shows something that was characteristic of James, in that he had a very clear geometrical view of the world. He could see things very well in 3 dimensions, and where some people will always do some problems by algebra, he often had a visual solution to a problem. So when he left Edinburgh Academy, he stayed on in Edinburgh for a couple of years. And we should note that Peter Guthrie Tait actually went straight to Cambridge. So he, in a sense, leapfrogged James here. So he studied under James Forbes, who was really a very good mentor to him, Philip Kelland and Sir William Hamilton. He didn't find things tough, so he largely pursued his own interests and then left without taking a degree and went down to Cambridge after a couple of years, initially to Peterhouse, and then he transferred to Trinity College, where he stayed. And then I don't think it's quite like the Bullingdon Club, but he was invited to join a group, a secret society called the Apostles. And this was the intellectual elite of Cambridge, and it was by invitation only. So he was certainly recognized as an outstanding figure at that time. And importantly, he was tutored by William Hopkins. Now at Cambridge, and it's still the case today, if you get a first in maths, you're called a wrangler. And if you come top of the class in maths, you're called a senior wrangler. And William Hopkins was a kind of wrangler maker. And various people, he would take on students and try to get them into at least the class of wranglers, the first class students. And in fact, James graduated in 1854 as this only the second wrangler. And in fact, just before him, Peter Guthrie Tait had been the first, the senior wrangler, a couple of years previously. He was second to a mathematician called Edward Routh, but there was a higher prize called the Smith Prize, and they shared it. And then he stayed on to do research and became a fellow of Trinity in 1855. There's a couple of very interesting things here. And sorry, my own screen's a little bit obscured. I'll just see if I can move. No, better not fiddle with it anymore. But there's a comment I can really relate to here, because Hopkins, who was the wrangler maker, had seen the top students at Cambridge over many, many years. So the real top mathematicians. And he said this, as recorded by one of Maxwell's contemporaries: Maxwell is unquestionably the most extraordinary man he has met with in the whole range of his experience. He says it appears impossible for Maxwell to think incorrectly on physical subjects. And I can see that as being a completely true quote. When you see the work that he did and the speed with which he got to the correct answer, you think that really applies. And on the right-hand side, is the kind of question that Maxwell would have been doing for Hopkins. The date shows that it's prior to taking his final exams, and it's one of these Cambridge questions that is fiendishly difficult, but essentially useless. But it looks as though you have a chain from A to B lying on a horizontal table, and you give it a tug, and the question is, what's the motion of a general point on the chain? So Maxwell, thinking this was a fairly stupid thing, decided he would write his answer to the question as a poem. And you can read the first few lines. Sorry, I won't do it for you because I've got my own picture over that at the moment. But this was another characteristic of Maxwell. He often wrote poems, very many of them, but this one makes me very jealous because when this is printed out, it's one sheet of A4, entirely rhyming verse. In amongst the words are numbers, and the numbers, when you turn the piece of paper over, refer to the equations that lead to the correct answer. But it was obviously to Maxwell really a rather trivial problem. So you can find that for yourself. Throughout his life, and we'll mention this as we go along, he was really interested in colour from the perspective of perception, not so much as a mathematical topic. And so he had started working with Forbes on this, and he was one who he followed on from the ideas of Thomas Young, and he picked red, green, and blue as the primary colours from which everything else could be generated. And he's thought of often as a mathematician, but he was very much an experimentalist. And one of his experiments was to look at retina, and he had a sufficient way with dogs that he could examine theirs and have them comply as well. Now, the big topic of electromagnetism, he actually published his first paper of 3 while he was at Trinity in 1855 and 1856. And he was really interested in Michael Faraday's ideas, which are shown in the bottom 2 diagrams, where you see what you probably did at school, which was take a bar magnet and sprinkle iron filings. And so Faraday had this amazing intuition for describing and understanding science, but he had no advantages of education and he had no mathematics, which limited the degree to which other people gave his ideas credibility. But Maxwell certainly did. And so the first paper of Faraday's lines of force tried to make some kind of fluid analogy for electricity and magnetism. And very importantly in those 2 diagrams, one is a bar magnet, but the other one is a coil of wire with a current flowing through it. And so you get the same shapes. So that's a big step in this story because you're linking electricity and magnetism together. So 1856, he got his first job and he went to Aberdeen. And he was appointed as Professor of Natural Philosophy. And it was a real shame because his father, who was really very much his friend as well, died shortly before his success in his application was announced in April 1856. But it's quite amusing that in 1857 he complained in a letter, "No jokes of any kind are understood here. I have not made one for 2 months, and if I feel one coming, I shall bite my tongue." So apologies to any Aberdonians in the audience. But he did make the strategic move of marrying the principal's daughter. And so he married Catherine Dewar in 1858. It would be nice if there was a relation to whiskey or the Dewar flask here, but there isn't. It was the Reverend Daniel Dewar. He also invested in Aberdeen Music Hall and helped to bring the very significant meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science to Aberdeen. And there's a story that up until the 1920s, he was being paid dividends, which were sent by a firm of solicitors to Aberdeen University, who returned them all saying, not known. so, so that is one of the problems. Not known is what we want to cure. And then, despite marrying the principal's daughter, Aberdeen, when they merged, Marischal College and King's College chose to make James redundant. But what did he do? Oh, yes. And a notable student there at the time was George Rees, who became the moderator of the General Assembly of Scotland and the father of Lord Rees of Stonehaven of BBC fame. And Marshall signed his certificate here saying that George Rees turned up on time, he behaved very well, and that the quality of his studies was such that he could be put in the order of merit. So apparently Lord Rees had this certificate framed on his wall because he saw it as his destiny to put to work for the public good the radio waves whose existence had been predicted by his father's great teacher. And there's Rees, who said he hoped to inform, educate, and entertain. This evening, I'm going to settle for saying 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So I don't know which of those I'll achieve, if any. So what did he do scientifically? Well, he went to Aberdeen as a very young professor of natural philosophy, and so he would have been very busy. So it is entirely amazing to my mind that he took on a problem that was set from Cambridge called the Adams Prize, which was to consider the structure and motion of the rings of Saturn, which could be seen by telescope, but little more could be said about them than they existed. But somehow James decided to take on this problem, and he considered, could they be solid, could they be liquid, or could they be rubble or particulate, if you want the posher word. And he did a tremendous amount of work and published something like 80 pages, which he submitted as his answer, having come to the conclusion that they could only be stable if it was rings of rubble. And the Astronomer Royal, Sir George Airy, said, this was one of the most remarkable applications of mathematics to physics that I have ever seen. And this really made his name. So he won the prize, and perhaps not surprisingly, no one else entered because they wouldn't have a clue where to start. But of course, he could win the prize for the elegance of his answers and the complexity of the mathematics that he had applied to the problem. But you couldn't tell whether he was right or wrong. But inevitably, when the spacecraft went there, they saw exactly what Maxwell had predicted. So he was right. And he also built mechanical models to illustrate how these particles in the rings would move. Another piece of work of great significance was thinking about how gases behave. And it was a little bit like when we used to watch the National Lottery and you have the balls bouncing all over the place. So there was at that time this idea of molecules bouncing around in a gas. But what Maxwell said, and this was a big intellectual leap for the time, was to say, well, they're all going to be going at different speeds. And so if you're going to understand the behavior of a gas, you're going to have to think in statistical terms. And he wrote down on the right-hand side, this diagram shows a shape, a mathematical shape, which tells you over here there would be slow ones, over here fast ones. And depending on the temperature, there would be some probability distribution of the speeds of the gases. And in order to work out the properties of the gas, you need to take into account this distribution. So he really revolutionized physics in that sense, in saying in order to understand nature properly, you have to apply statistical methods. Okay, so that is a huge thing. And I would always say, if Maxwell had never touched electricity and magnetism, it will still have been a most remarkable career. Now, surprisingly, he didn't actually seem to do much in electricity and magnetism during his time in Aberdeen, but he did a lot on colour. So he had settled on red, green, and blue, and this is it started with a color wheel using red, green, and blue in different proportions, spinning it, and then saying, what do you think you see? What color do you think you see? And today we can produce this rather beautiful by having three beams of light, red, green, and blue. And it's still remarkable to me, just forget science, you just look at it, that when you add those things together, what you get as a result of the brain's perception is white. So that just seems magic to me. So what he also did, so he went on, and what I would call his sort of Pink Floyd stage was going from a rotating disc to a prism in which he could separate white light into its component colors and then recombine them in different proportions. And then he would ask people to look through, and he must have had something like a Dulux color card and say, okay, point to the one you think it is. And so we're getting to the question of, yeah, we agree it's a certain color, but are we seeing the same thing? So Maxwell did many experiments of this kind, and he summarized his results using a triangle like this with green, blue, and red, and inside the results of mixing different colors. Sorry. And this is still really the basis of the modern standard for color mixing. And of course, in effect, I've used this in preparing a PowerPoint, which is where all the colors come as mixtures of red, green, and blue. So they sacked him. But at the same time, James Forbes went off to be principal at St. Andrews, and so a vacancy arose. But this is where Peter Guthrie Tait reappears, because he also applied, and Edinburgh selected Peter Guthrie Tait and said to Maxwell, thank you for your application, but on this occasion you were not successful. And nevertheless, they have since honoured him by having a major edifice on the King's Building site named after him. So there was another vacancy in King's College London, and so off he went, and he was successful in his application there. And this is now 1861, very interesting, because Faraday would have been in charge of arranging this lecture at the Royal Institution, since Faraday was now head of the Royal Institution, an evening lecture. And following all his work on colour, Maxwell chose to take a tartan ribbon or rosette. There was only black and white photography. So very much on the basis of his colour box that he'd invented, he took 3 black and white photographs of a tartan ribbon, but took the photographs through red, green, and blue filters. He then reasoned that if he produced the positives, he could then reproject with 3 lanterns through the 3 positives and through the 3 filters that the red, green, and blue filters that they had been taken with, and so reconstruct the original color image. So you can imagine buying a ticket, going along and seeing the world's first color projected image, if you like, the first PowerPoint. So it was fairly amazing that Maxwell was able to come up with this simply for the purposes of a public lecture in 1861. And in fact, the work on colour had gained him the Rumford Medal of the Royal Society in London. So that was a fairly prestigious award. And this was essentially for largely qualitative work on the understanding of colour. I put this on just to say Maxwell had 3 attempts at understanding electricity and magnetism. And the second one was a major advance. In the first one, he had tried to use an analogy with fluid flow, with streamlines and so on. In the second one, he had tried to develop an analogy, a rather mechanical analogy. And in some ways, it looks quite bizarre because he essentially had big cannonballs that could move because they had small marbles between them that allowed relative motion. But he managed to build a remarkable theory that could explain by analogy many of the results of experiments. And that included coming to the conclusion, as we see here, that he writes down, we can scarcely avoid the inference that light consists in the transverse undulations of the same medium, which is the cause of electric and magnetic phenomena. So this was very much a big deal. And this was his second attempt. And it's about the only occasion where he didn't finish something in one go, I would say. Also during that time, he was on a committee and he used apparatus designed by William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, which is on display over in Glasgow. And it sounded quite boring because what they were interested in was standardizing the measurement of electrical resistance. But this was a crucial question at the time because this was the start of the Victorian internet and the amazing feats of laying cables, copper cables across the oceans. And so there's a huge question about if I put a signal in at one end of a very long copper cable, would it reach the other end or not? And so measuring the resistance of copper became a very big deal. And in fact, the whole enterprise of transoceanic cables was one where Kelvin made quite a lot of money by getting involved. And then came along his third attempt, and Maxwell was not one for showing off. But nevertheless, in a letter to his cousin in 1865, he said, I have a paper afloat containing an electromagnetic theory of light, which till I am convinced to the contrary, I hold to be of great guns. And this turned out to be a complete triumph. And so what Maxwell did in the third attempt, third stage of the development of the ideas, was to abandon the idea of analogies. He showed that by writing down in mathematical form how various experiments worked, he could then simply rely on the mathematics and leave it to the equations and work out what would happen. And so a couple of quotes there. And again, he was saying, from my equations on electricity and magnetism, we can find a number. And that number is so nearly that of light, that this is what electromagnetic fields must support. Light must be, again, somewhat repetitive, but saying again, there must be electromagnetic radiations that propagate at the speed of light. And he also anticipated here, including radiant heat and other radiations. So he recognized that our eyes are just an instrument for a portion of a wider electromagnetic spectrum. And he always acknowledged Faraday. And it was, again, it's a different story, but by chance, Faraday had actually said in 1846, he had speculated that light might be the propagation of transverse magnetic disturbances. And so Faraday was truly amazing in his imagination and in being correct as well. So this time from King's College, James simply chose to return to Glenlair. He wasn't pushed in any way, but with the intensity and the quality of work they was doing, there's possibly that he just felt a little bit burnt out. So, but he also loved the place. So he and Catherine returned there and were there from 1865 to 1871. And there he wrote it all down. And this is the 2 volumes of the treatise on electricity and magnetism. Sorry about the 19. That was finally published in 1873. And again, I like to refer back to what he said about Faraday. So he said, before I began the study of electricity, I thought, I'm not going to have my head turned by the mathematics. I'm going to read Faraday's experimental results. And this is very nice about Faraday, that Faraday essentially didn't think about objects, but he thought more about the space in between them as mattering. So he had this idea of a field, an electric field and a magnetic field. And it was this that conveyed essentially information in the form of electromagnetic waves. And so this was all Faraday's imagination, but he was unable to formulate that mathematically, which Maxwell certainly was able to do. And if I put it in only a couple of slides, then some of the question was, at one stage, there were 3 things that seemed quite distinct and unrelated. Electricity, like you can at Christmas rub the balloon on your jumper and stick it on the wall, and you've got something electric. You can play with 2 rocks that can either repel or attract, and we call it magnetism. Nothing obviously connecting the 2. And then light even seems more remote from those 2 things. But over a series of experiments, you ask the question, could there be a unifying theory explaining very diverse experimental results? So that was the challenge that James was essentially taking on. And in the 2-slide summary of this talk, what he did was say, well, yes, they can. And they can by writing 4 equations, looking at E as electric field and B as magnetic field. And the consequence of those equations is that you can propagate electric and magnetic fields through space, and they will travel at the speed of light. You can determine that speed from experiments in electricity and magnetism, and you will get the same answer as had been determined by essentially reflecting a beam of light and simply measuring distance over time. And so problem solved in 2 slides. The only problem with it at the time was that these were theoretical results of Maxwell's. And so unfortunately had to wait until 1886 before Heinrich Hertz conducted experiments that showed that waves of the types that Maxwell's theory predicted actually existed. And Hertz thought they were a kind of academic interest only. He couldn't really see any use for them. And of course, we're focusing on Maxwell, but he wasn't alone in this endeavor. And so here are some of the people who are contributing to the understanding of electricity and magnetism, starting with Galvani experimenting with frogs' legs, Volta designing a cell, Ampere, Ørsted, particularly Ampere carrying out very careful experiments on electric currents, and then Faraday, who actually started his endeavors in magnetism largely as Maxwell was born. And it was these two-way links. So Faraday's big contribution there was showing that you could connect. There's a two-way connection between electricity and magnetism. Electric currents make magnetic fields, and by changing a magnetic field threading through a coil of wire, you could make an electric current flow. And then you also had Thomson and Tate, and then Clerk Maxwell himself. And as you see, the length of this line is unfortunately short. And of course, many other scientists, particularly in Germany. There was a big effort in Germany to understand electricity and magnetism. So while he was at Glenlair, he did other things as well. He wrote it all down, but it's almost strange that one of the awards that he got was from the Royal Society of Edinburgh for essentially work on structural engineering. And some of this was applied to a certain extent in the fourth bridge. Another very significant thing was something that he recognized in his work on the electrical resistance was a general problem of doing experiments where you want to keep something at a constant level. And so in that case, it had been trying to keep a coil of wire rotating at a constant speed. But he generalized the problem and wrote a paper, and that paper began the subject of control theory, which we would now call cybernetics. And Norbert Wiener, 80 years later, became the sort of grandfather of cybernetics, which is now a huge subject. And he wrote down right at the start that Maxwell had written down all the correct equations. And an important part of this is the recognition, as is used now in many systems, of applying feedback in order to control a system. When I first saw it, he wrote a paper on hills and dales, which I thought must be on topography, but it's actually on the mathematical ideas of topology. And he also wrote a book on the theory of heat. And he invented a thought experiment where you have some gas which has equal distribution of hot and cold molecules in it. But he asked, well, what if you had a little demon that let hot ones into the top half and let cold ones into the bottom half? Then can you end up with this, which would be contravening the second law of thermodynamics? So this was a thought experiment that has puzzled physics for many years. And so it was very original in his thinking over many. Get his attention on a topic and he'll do something original.
That's why I trust so much.
So in 1871, the Duke of Devonshire, who was Chancellor of the University of Cambridge, gave a load of money to build a new physics lab. And for that reason, Maxwell was tempted out of retirement, went to Cambridge and became Professor of Experimental Physics in 1871. He started with the drawings for the building, acquired the apparatus and delivered the project in 1874. And on the right are excerpts from the Cavendish magazine celebrating the 150 years of the Cavendish laboratory, out of which I think there have been 30 Nobel Prizes. So although he had largely done it in Glenlair, the treatise was published. He published another book on matter and motion, And he also published The Electrical Researches of the Honourable Henry Cavendish, who was related to the Duke of Devonshire. And that was one of the conditions of the endowment, was that the professor appointed would look into Cavendish's work, which actually turned out to be remarkable. But then he died in Cambridge on the 5th of November, 1879, age 48, from the same cause as his mother, abdominal cancer. And then he was brought back to be buried in Parton Kirk, close to Glenlair, together with his mother and father, and his wife, when she died, was buried there too. On George Street in Edinburgh, there's a statue that was put up in 2008, and on it there are two motifs: the colour wheel, and at his feet is his dog, and he always had a dog, and it was always called Toby, and so I'm not sure which one it was, but I like to think it was perhaps Toby Bark 3 there. And there are friezes on the statue for the school of Newton and the school of Einstein. So have they been of any value? Well, yes, despite Heinrich Hertz's pessimism, I think we know that we are entirely bathed in electromagnetic waves of one kind or another that are doing very useful things for us. In fact, all of modern society is now dependent on electromagnetic waves. I'm keeping an eye on the clock, so I'll just refer to some of the fan club members. And Einstein, I'll just point to the bottom one, because what Maxwell didn't realize necessarily, because he didn't have reason to think about it, was that his equations were not compatible with the Newtonian view of the world. But it turned out that they are compatible with a special relativity. And so Einstein said he stood on the shoulders of Maxwell because he recognized that problem. And so special relativity is in a sense embedded in Maxwell's equations. And Richard Feynman was a Nobel Prize winning American physicist. And he had a couple of quotes. He says, "If you look from 10,000 years from now, there can be little doubt that the most significant event of the 19th century will be Maxwell's discovery of the laws of electrodynamics." And then down the bottom here, what he essentially says, I don't care how he got there, but he got the right answer. And he says, untold numbers of experiments have confirmed that his equations are correct. And so that's why he comes to the judgment that he does above. Just a couple of things if you want to follow up. There's a very good book by Basil Marn, very readable. One of our former trustees, John Arthur, has written a very detailed book on the family trees relating to the Clerk family, and both on the father side and the mother's side, and it goes into amazing detail. And he's now actually put it on the web, johnarthur.com. Lewis Campbell, his school friend, and William Garnett, who he appointed at Cambridge, wrote a biography in 1882. And another one of our trustees, James Rausio, has put that on the web too, so that can be downloaded. And what I haven't, so I'll just take that out, what I haven't mentioned very much in this talk was Maxwell's religious faith. But last year, Bruce Ritchie published a book on that, which is also provides great detail on that aspect of his life. And then there's a further book called The Maxwellians, which has Heaviside, Lodge, and Fitzgerald as some of the people who took the theory and took it on, and then eventually to be all exploited, particularly by Marconi. And so what I've said relies on information and knowledge I've gained from many people, some of whom I'm recognized. I've put over here. here is the Foundation's website. You can actually do an online tour of the museum, but we're very happy to have visitors, and we participate in the Edinburgh Open Days every September. And so I'll invite you to either visit or look around, and I'll finish there.